Settle in and let yourself grow heavy. There's nowhere to be now, nothing to do but rest. Let your mind wander to the slow mystery of a vanished fleet and its forgotten fortune. If you drift off easily here, subscribe. A new one arrives every night. In the great hall at Troy, in January of 1129, the cold came through the stone as it always does in French midwinter, not suddenly, but steadily, from the floor upward, from the walls inward, settling into the room the way cold has always settled into rooms built before the art of keeping it out was understood. The breath of the men assembled there was faintly visible. The ecclesiastical banners hanging from the upper walls moved almost imperceptibly in draughts that found their way through joints in the masonry that no amount of care had ever fully sealed. Bernard of Clairvaux sat at the long table near the head of the room, and the text in front of him, written on vellum in a careful hand, the ink still holding the darkness of its recent making, was a rule for a brotherhood that had existed for nearly a decade without one. Hugues de Payon stood before the assembly in a plain white mantle. The red cross that would later mark the order's habit had not yet been granted. The mantle was simply white, and it was the whiteness of a thing not yet fully decided, an institution in the process of becoming what it would remain for the next 2 centuries. De Payens had come from Jerusalem. He had founded the Brotherhood there around 1119, in the years after the First Crusade had made the Holy Land a place that Christian pilgrims could reach, and that Christian soldiers could, for a time, hold. The Brotherhood's original purpose had been straightforward. 9 men pledged to protect the roads leading from the coast to Jerusalem, guarding pilgrims against the ambushes and banditry that made those roads dangerous in ways that the formal military success of the Crusade had not resolved. They had taken up residence near the Temple Mount, in a wing of the royal palace that abutted what was believed to be the site of Solomon's temple, and from that location they had taken their name, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon, the Knights of the Temple, the Templars. Bernard read from the draft rule, his voice carried in the hall. The text established ranks within the order, defined the obligations of those ranks, set out the liturgical requirements of the brothers' days, and created the institutional framework that would allow 9 men who had organized around a shared purpose to become something recognizable to the wider church, a religious order with defined structure, defined discipline, and defined accountability. Bernard was among the most respected ecclesiastical voices in Europe at that moment, and his presence at Troy was not incidental. He had written in support of the new order before the council convened, in a treatise that made the theological case for a brotherhood of men who were simultaneously monks and soldiers, bound by vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and also charged with the use of arms in the defense of Christian pilgrims. The apparent paradox of a monk who killed was one the medieval church had been working to resolve for some time. Bernard's argument was that the violence of such men, directed at the enemies of Christendom, was not sinful, but meritorious, that the sword used in righteous defense was not a contradiction of the monastic vow, but an extension of it into a different domain. The council at Troy accepted that argument in its institutional form. The rule was ratified. The brotherhood became an order. Hugues de Payens had arrived in France as the leader of a small group of knights living austerely in Jerusalem. He left Troy as the first Grand Master of a papally recognized institution, with a written constitution and the formal blessing of the church behind it. The founding document was preserved, the vellum it was written on survived, and the order it described would grow in ways that no one in that cold hall on that January day could have reasonably anticipated. The growth was not dramatic in its early years. It was gradual and institutional, the kind of expansion that comes not from a single decisive moment, but from the accumulation of smaller recognitions, donations, and privileges compounding quietly over time. Nobles across Europe, moved by the dual appeal of military piety and the practical need to support the crusading effort in the Levant, began granting land and revenues to the new order. A farm in Burgundy, a mill in southern England, a manor in the Iberian Peninsula. Each gift was modest individually. Together, across the years that followed Troy, they began to constitute something larger, an economic base that the order administered with care and that generated revenues it could direct toward its operations in the Holy Land. The order sent the produce of these estates east: grain from English manors, wool from Irish holdings, wine from French and Iberian vineyards, all of it converted, eventually into the resources that kept Templar knights in armor and Templar fortifications in repair along the routes and coastlines of the Crusader states. The logistics of moving wealth across that distance, in an era when roads were uncertain and the sea dangerous, and the mechanisms of long-distance transfer, still primitive by later standards, presented problems that the Order's administrators gradually developed systems to address. It was in addressing those problems that the Templars came to develop an instrument that historians of medieval finance have spent considerable time examining. A pilgrim in Paris who intended to travel to the Holy Land faced a practical difficulty that had nothing to do with the journey's dangers and everything to do with its economics. Carrying significant quantities of coin was itself a hazard. Roads were watched by bandits. Seaborne passage was vulnerable. A pilgrim who deposited funds at the Paris preceptory of the Templars and received in exchange a written document, a letter of credit, sealed and marked in a way that identified it as authentic, could carry that document across the distance and present it at a Templar preceptory in Acre or Cyprus and receive there an equivalent sum in local currency. The physical coin never traveled. The record of an obligation traveled instead, and the Templar network, with its houses on both ends and its institutional coherence spanning the distance between them, guaranteed the exchange. This was not, in its essential mechanism, something the Templars invented from nothing. Merchants in the Mediterranean world had used instruments resembling letters of credit for centuries, but the Templars systematized it, extended it across a larger geographic range, and embedded it within a structure that offered the guarantee of institutional continuity rather than the guarantee of a single merchant's solvency. The letter of credit worked because the Templar order as a whole stood behind it, because the house in Acre trusted the house in Paris, and the house in Paris trusted the house in Acre, and both trusted the institutional framework that connected them. It was one of the earliest formalized credit transfer mechanisms of this kind in the Western world, and historians of medieval finance regard it as a genuine, documented innovation rather than an embellishment of the order's legend. The letter of credit itself was a physical object, parchment folded into quarters, worn soft at the creases from the long journey in a pilgrim's clothing from the roads of France to the port, across the sea, along the Levantine coast to the gates of a preceptory that had been standing for decades and whose administrators recognized the seal and cipher marks that authenticated the document. The pilgrim handed over the paper. The preceptory's clerk consulted the records. The sum was counted out. The letter was filed or destroyed. The transaction was complete, and it had occurred without a single coin crossing the water. The order's land holdings by the middle of the 13th century were vast by any accounting that has survived. 9,000 manors, preceptories, and commanderies has been the estimate that historians have arrived at from aggregating the documentary evidence, charters of donation, property surveys, administrative records from the order's various regional houses, and the inventories that were made at various points in the order's institutional history. These holdings stretched from Ireland in the northwest to Cyprus and the remaining Crusader states in the east. They were not a uniform collection. Some were large agricultural estates generating substantial annual revenues. Some were small urban properties whose value lay in their location rather than their productive capacity. Some were fortified compounds with their own mills, barns, and churches. Some were simple houses in market towns that served as administrative nodes within the order's network. Each one was a revenue-generating unit. Each one was administered by a local official, a preceptor, a commander, a bailiff, who kept accounts, collected what was owed, managed the labor of whatever agricultural operation the property supported, and sent periodic reports and remittances upward through the order's administrative hierarchy. A Templar preceptory in the Irish countryside would have looked, from the outside, much like any other modest fortified agricultural establishment of its period: stone granary, stone hall, enclosed yard. What distinguished it was its institutional connection to everything else, to the house in Paris that coordinated the French and Irish revenues, to the master's headquarters in the Levant that received and deployed what the European operations generated, and to the papal authority in Rome that oversaw and protected the whole structure. The protection that Rome extended to the Templars was not merely symbolic. In 1139, 10 years after the council at Troy, Pope Innocent II issued the bull Omni Datum Optimum. The document was specific in its grants. The Templars were exempted from diocesan tithes, the payments that other landowners owed to local bishops and cathedral churches as a share of their revenues. They were permitted to collect their own revenues, to build their own churches, to conduct their own liturgical services, and to operate their own clergy, whose accountability ran to the order rather than to the local ecclesiastical hierarchy. Their financial affairs were answerable not to any bishop, not to any archbishop, but to the Pope alone. The document lay flat on a writing desk somewhere in the papal scriptoria, its seal dangling on a cord, its margins annotated in the hand of a later administrator who had worked through what the exemptions meant in practical terms, what they implied for the order's revenues across a decade, across a generation, across the span of time in which the rest of the church's landowners were paying their diocesan tithes, and the Templars were not. The calculation was not a small one. A large estate subject to normal diocesan obligations would have sent a meaningful fraction of its annual revenue out of its own coffers and into the diocesan treasury. An estate exempt from that obligation retained that fraction, compounded across 9,000 properties, compounded across the century, and more between Omni Datum Optimum and the period in which the order's wealth had become a matter of interest to kings. The cumulative effect was enormous. Omni Datum Optimum was not the only such grant. Subsequent papal documents extended and reinforced the privileges, adjusted their scope, added new exemptions, clarified ambiguities in the original text. The order's financial immunity from ordinary ecclesiastical taxation was not a one-time gift, but an ongoing institutional characteristic, renewed and reconfirmed across generations of popes. The records of those renewals survive in various archives. The seals are legible. The Latin is dense but clear. The story they tell, taken together, is of an institution that was permitted by the highest ecclesiastical authority to accumulate wealth without the erosions that normal feudal and ecclesiastical taxation would have imposed on any comparable landowner. The Templar preceptory in Ireland, its granary doors open to a damp field, its carts loaded with wool bales waiting to be counted and logged before the week's revenue figures were sent by rider to Paris. This was one unit of that system. The clerks who kept its accounts were administering a small portion of a network that stretched across an entire continent and an adjacent sea. The wool bales would be counted, the figures would go into a ledger, the ledger's totals would be summarized and sent east, and the revenue would join the revenues from hundreds of other units, pooling eventually into the order's central resources and being deployed from there toward whatever the order's current operational priorities required. The Irish preceptory was not extraordinary. It was ordinary, one of many such places functioning in the way such places were designed to function, generating its modest revenues reliably and sending them upward through a system that had been designed with sufficient administrative care to remain functional across great distances and many years. Its ordinariness was, in a sense, its most striking feature. The Templar financial machine was not spectacular in any individual part. It was spectacular in its aggregation, in the fact that so many modest units, each functioning quietly in its own context, could together constitute an economic institution of genuinely extraordinary scale. The Paris Temple was the center of that scale in France, and by the late 13th century, it had become something more than simply the French administrative headquarters of a religious order. The fortified enclosure in the Marais district, its walls thick, its towers high, its interior compound housing stables, and chapels and administrative offices, and vaulted storage chambers, had become, through a process more practical than formal, the de facto royal treasury of France. King Philip IV, by the late 13th century, was storing crown jewels and state funds within those vaults. The Templar compound was more secure than any purely royal facility he maintained, its administrators more reliable in their record-keeping than the royal clerks of his household, and its institutional independence from the ordinary channels of French political life made it paradoxically a safer place to keep what a king needed to keep safe. The Paris Temple's donjon tower rose above the rooftops of the Marais district. Its upper windows were narrow, set in stone that showed no ornament, catching the gray light of a winter morning across the city below. In the courtyard beneath those windows, the daily administrative life of the order's French center moved at a pace that was unhurried and routine, clerks carrying ledger books between buildings, riders arriving with revenue reports from provincial preceptories, horses being led through the gate after long journeys on rain-softened roads. It was the ordinary activity of a large institution conducting its affairs, unremarkable in its daily texture, except for the scale of what moved through it and the significance of what rested in its vaults. The king kept his treasure there. The nobles of France who owed debts to the order kept their obligations recorded in the Templars' ledgers. The pilgrims who had deposited funds at the Paris preceptory years earlier and had not yet redeemed their letters of credit represented a form of liability, a set of obligations that the order held in trust against eventual redemption. The financial relationships the Paris Temple maintained stretched in every direction, north to England, south to Iberia, east to the Mediterranean routes and beyond, and inward into the structures of French royal finance itself. None of this had been planned at Troyes in January 1129. Bernard of Clairvaux had presided over the ratification of a rule for 9 men who had pledged to protect pilgrims on the roads of the Holy Land. The rule was sensible and modest in its ambitions. The order it described was designed to be functional, not necessarily to be wealthy. Wealth had come as a consequence of the order's functions, as donors gave land to support the crusading effort, as the letter of credit system generated the kind of trust that attracted larger depositors, as the papal privileges allowed revenues to accumulate without the normal losses to diocesan taxation, as each generation of administrators built on what the previous generation had established. The council hall at Troyes was cold in January. Bernard's breath was visible in the air as he read from the draft rule. Hugues de Payens stood before the assembly in his plain white mantle. The document on the table was the beginning of an institutional process that would, across the following century and a half, produce an economic structure that no one in that room had set out to create. The vellum of the rule would be copied and kept. The order it established would grow. The grants would accumulate. The privileges would compound. The revenues would build, and the vaults would fill. The process was slow and documented. Each step left records. Each grant was written down. Each privilege was confirmed in writing. The letters of credit bore seals and cipher marks that authenticated them across distances their authors had never traveled. The revenue reports went by rider from Irish fields and Burgundian farms to the counting rooms of Paris, and the figures they contained were entered into ledgers whose columns ran on for pages. It is the slowness of the accumulation that is, perhaps, its most striking quality. The way an institution could grow over the span of generations into something that a king would trust with his crown jewels, simply by doing what it had been designed to do, reliably, year after year, across the length of a continent. There was no single decisive moment of enrichment. There was no act of acquisition that transformed the order overnight, from modest to magnificent. There was only the patient accumulation of revenues that were exempt from taxation, of properties that were efficiently administered, of financial instruments that worked because the institution behind them was large enough and stable enough that the instruments could be trusted. The preceptories in England and Ireland sent their wool revenues to Paris. The French estates sent their wine revenues. The Iberian houses sent what their lands produced. The letter of credit system generated fees and float. The debt registers held obligations from the great houses of Europe, recorded in the Templars' meticulous hand, callable at need. And at the center of all of it, the Paris Temple stood, its donjon tower rising above the Marais, its vaults holding in trust what kings and pilgrims and nobles had placed there over the accumulated years. The gray light of a winter morning in Paris fell across the upper windows of the donjon. The courtyard below was quiet. The clerks moved between buildings with their ledger books. Inside the vaulted chambers, in the particular cold stillness of spaces built of stone and kept from the weather by thick walls, the order's wealth rested, coin and document, and jewel and instrument, the accumulated consequence of 150 years of institutional function. Bernard of Clairvaux had read from the rule. Hugues de Payens had stood in his plain white mantle and received the ratification of the assembly. The council at Troyes had recognized a brotherhood of 9 men and given it the institutional form it needed to endure. What endured across the decades that followed was something considerably larger than 9 men. It was a financial and military institution of a reach and scale that had made itself indispensable to the machinery of medieval commerce and royal administration alike, so indispensable in the final years of the 13th century that a king would keep his treasury within its walls because there was no better place to keep a treasury, and a pilgrim would carry its paper across the breadth of the Mediterranean because the paper was worth what it said it was worth. And no force of arms or accident of politics had yet arisen to make it otherwise. The order had not set out to become what it had become. It had simply done what it was designed to do, and the world had found that useful, and the revenues had come in, and the privileges had compounded, and the preceptories had multiplied, and the vaults in Paris had filled with what kings needed, stored, and what pilgrims needed secured, and all of it rested on any given winter morning in the quiet order of a large institution going about its ordinary business in the ordinary way. The donjon tower was simply there, above the merry rooftops, its stones unchanged from one year to the next, its vaults holding what they held. The gray light of the morning crossing its narrow upper windows without illuminating anything that the institution's administrators had not already counted, recorded, and placed in the appropriate column of the appropriate ledger, and noted there in the careful ink of a practiced hand as belonging precisely where it was. The La Rochelle quayside in the middle of a gray October afternoon holds a particular kind of stillness. The stone of the warehouse walls runs dark with damp, and the smell that rises from the harbor is salt and timber and the lanolin residue of stored wool bales, a smell that has been there so long it has worked its way into the mortar between the stones. Iron mooring rings are set into the quayside at regular intervals, each one worn smooth on its upper arc by the friction of countless ropes, and the water between the pilings moves in slow, unhurried rhythms, rising and falling against the timber with a sound that carries no urgency at all. This is the Templar harbor. This is the western edge of one of the most extensive logistics networks the medieval world had yet assembled, and it looks from the quayside like any other working port on the Atlantic coast of France, functional, orderly, smelling of commerce. The Templars had established their presence at La Rochelle because the harbor was deep. The natural geography of the bay allowed ocean-going vessels of considerable size to approach the quayside directly rather than requiring goods to be transshipped through smaller tenders, and that depth translated into efficiency, and efficiency translated into profit, and profit was what funded the order's operations across 3 continents. The compound itself ran along the waterfront in a configuration that reflected the Templars' characteristic approach to infrastructure, practical, fortified, and comprehensive in the functions it served under one administrative roof. There were warehouses with thick stone walls capable of maintaining the cool temperatures that preserved wool and grain across long voyages. There was a shipyard equipped to handle the repair and maintenance of large vessels, its timber stores covered against the Atlantic weather. There were administrative offices where clerks sat at writing tables and logged incoming cargo against expected manifests, checked outgoing loads against order records, and kept the running accounts that connected the La Rochelle operation to the wider financial architecture of the order. A dedicated quayside extended along the harbor front, its stone surface worn by decades of carts and cargo, wide enough to allow multiple vessels to be loaded or unloaded simultaneously without the operations interfering with one another. It was a working institution. The records that have survived from the Templar period at La Rochelle confirm this in the particular way that administrative documents confirm things, not through dramatic notation, but through the accumulation of mundane transactional detail, the kind of detail that only accretes when something is genuinely, continuously, ordinarily operating. Ships came in, goods were counted, figures were logged, ships went out. The routes those ships ran were documented well enough that modern historians have been able to reconstruct their broad outlines, though the specific records of individual voyages are far more fragmentary than one would wish. The northern arc of the Templar maritime network connected La Rochelle to English harbors at Southampton and Bristol, ports whose own records occasionally note the arrival of vessels associated with the order and the nature of their cargo. Wool moved along this route in both directions, baled and weighed at Templar estates in England and Ireland, transported to La Rochelle, processed through the order's continental network, and in some cases reshipped onward. The sheer volume of Templar landholding in England and Ireland meant that wool production on Templar estates was substantial enough to represent a significant commercial quantity, not a sideline, but a principal revenue stream managed with the same systematic attention the order applied to everything else. The southern routes carried different goods and served different purposes. La Rochelle connected through the Iberian coastline to Lisbon and to the ports of northern Spain, where the Templars maintained their own institutional presence, and where the kingdoms of Portugal and Aragon had long-standing relationships with the order that included not just crusading cooperation, but commercial entanglement. The route to Portugal in particular was significant because the Portuguese Templars were among the most active and well-organized branches of the order, and the movement of goods and financial instruments between La Rochelle and Lisbon represented a regular, institutionally maintained corridor. Horses bred at Templar farms for Crusader campaigns moved south along this route in some numbers. Agricultural produce from Templar estates in France and Iberia moved through the network in both directions, logged and tallied and shipped as part of an operation that in its scale and systematization bore more resemblance to a modern vertically integrated commercial enterprise than to anything a casual observer of medieval Europe might have expected to find. Through Gibraltar, the Mediterranean opened, and the routes extended further to the Templar strongholds on Cyprus, to the remaining Crusader ports, to the whole Eastern theater where the order had its origins, and toward which, in theory, if not always in practical effect, the accumulated revenues of the Western network were ultimately directed. La Rochelle was the hinge. It was the point where the Atlantic and the Mediterranean connected, where the revenues of the northern and western estates fed into the broader logistical stream, where the ships that served both zones came and went under the order's administrative oversight. The harbor had been built to serve this function, and for the better part of 2 centuries it had served it without interruption. Wine moved through the port as well, from Templar vineyards in France and Iberia, its casks loaded into the holds of vessels, whose masters knew the Atlantic swells well enough to judge how tight the lashing needed to be before they cleared the harbor mouth. The metalwork that Templar estates in various regions produced, agricultural tools, structural fittings, the outputs of estate forges, found its way into the cargo manifests alongside the wool and the wine and the horses and the grain. The Templar network was not a treasury in the way a modern person might imagine a treasury, a room of gold, guarded and vaulted. It was a flow. It was an ongoing commercial and logistical operation whose revenues moved continuously through the system, accumulating at certain nodes and dispersing from others, managed by clerks who wrote their entries in Latin on rolls of parchment, and then sealed and dispatched those rolls to the administrative centers where the wider accounts were kept. One such roll, the kind that would have existed in many copies across the Templar network, each representing a portion of the order's ongoing commercial activity, would have looked, in physical terms, like a moderate length of parchment covered in ruled columns. The columns would have listed cargo by type and weight, departure and destination port, the date of loading, the name or designation of the vessel, and any notable conditions attached to the consignment. The handwriting would have been a professional clerk's hand, consistent and rapid, with abbreviations for frequently repeated terms and occasional corrections where a figure had been overwritten. At some point the entries would stop, not with any notation about why, not with a summary or a closing statement, just the trailing edge of the last entry and then blank parchment to the end of the roll. This is how most medieval administrative documents end, not with conclusions, but with the simple cessation of whatever process was generating them. The specific question of what the La Rochelle fleet carried and where it went in October of 1307 rests in the historical record almost entirely on this kind of absence. What can be established from the fragmentary evidence available, from Templar trial testimonies gathered in the years following the arrests, from the royal inventories of the seized compound, from the documented discrepancies between what was known to exist and what was subsequently found, is that ships were present at La Rochelle before the arrests and were not present afterward. The night of October 12th, 1307, is the fulcrum on which this absence turns. The mechanics of what the record suggests are worth holding carefully, because the temptation is always to let a gap in the documentary record become something more narratively satisfying than it actually is. What the record suggests without confirming is movement, some number of vessels, and the record does not establish how many, what type, what size, or what they carried departed the La Rochelle harbor in the period immediately surrounding the royal orders that went out across France on that October night. The Templar trial testimonies that touch on this question are not the testimony of witnesses with direct knowledge of fleet operations. They are accounts produced under conditions that make their reliability difficult to assess, in proceedings whose documented character involved the application of physical pressure to extract statements. What they suggest about the fleet's departure is fragmentary and indirect. What the royal inventories of the seized La Rochelle compound do establish is what was there when Philip IV's officers arrived to record it. The inventory lists grain, it lists livestock, it lists household goods of the kind that would have been found in any administrative compound of comparable size: furniture, kitchen equipment, the ordinary material culture of a functioning institution. There is modest coin. The inventory is not empty in the sense that it records real goods with real values, but it records the goods of an institution that had been stripped of its most portable and valuable assets before the royal officers arrived to count what remained. There are no fleet vessels in the inventory. There is no gold. There is no bullion. There are no financial instruments of the kind that would have represented the credit obligations running through a major commercial node in the order's network. This absence is the central fact the historical record offers, not a dramatic escape, not a crisis departure with torches and shouting on the quayside. Simply the documented reality that when the inventory was taken, the most portable and most valuable things were not there, and neither were the ships. The harbor master's log from La Rochelle in October 1307 does not appear in the French Royal Archives. This is a fact about the archival record rather than a conclusion about what happened. Medieval administrative documents disappeared for many reasons that had nothing to do with deliberate concealment, fire, flood, the ordinary entropy of unheated storage rooms over 7 centuries, the dislocations of subsequent political upheaval, the simple failure of any later authority to treat the document as worth preserving and binding and keeping dry. The absence of a harbor master's log is not by itself evidence that one was deliberately removed or destroyed. It is evidence that one has not been found, which is a different and considerably more modest claim. No Templar fleet manifest from La Rochelle has been identified in any archive. This is also a fact about the archival record, and it carries the same caveat. Templar administrative records from the period immediately surrounding the arrests are sparse throughout the entire documentary inheritance, not only for La Rochelle. The systematic seizure of Templar properties across France in October and November of 1307 was not an operation designed to preserve the order's paperwork for the benefit of future historians. Royal officers were directed to secure assets. The fate of whatever administrative records existed in Templar preceptories and commanderies across France in those weeks is for the most part unknown. Some records survived because they ended up in royal or ecclesiastical archives, whose later curators maintained them. Many did not survive, and the reason they did not survive is almost certainly administrative indifference rather than deliberate suppression, though the distinction matters less to the historian than the result. What this means, practically, is that the departure of ships from La Rochelle in October 1307 is a conclusion drawn from silence rather than from positive evidence. The ships are not listed in the inventories of seized assets. The documentary record of their existence as fleet assets, which would have been maintained in order, manifests and administrative rolls, has not been located. The Templar trial testimonies that touch on the question are indirect and produced under circumstances that complicate their value as straightforward evidence. The harbor master's log that might have recorded departures is absent from the archive. The result is a historical puzzle, whose most honest description is not a mystery waiting to be solved, but a gap in the record that the available evidence cannot close. This is, in its own way, a more interesting thing than a mystery with a solution would be. A mystery with a solution is a closed room that someone has a key to. A gap in the archival record is a room whose lock may not correspond to any key that has yet been made. The ships were operating, the harbor was functioning, the routes were documented, the revenues were flowing. And then, in the days surrounding October 13th, 1307, the documentary evidence stops, not with a dramatic final entry, not with a note of explanation, but simply because the institution generating the records was no longer in a position to generate them, and whatever records existed in the La Rochelle compound at the moment the royal officers arrived were either taken as part of the administrative seizure and subsequently lost to the archive, or were no longer there to be taken. A Templar cargo manifest, if one were to examine it in its physical form, would be a roll of parchment roughly the width of a man's two hands, placed side by side, its surface covered in a small professional script, arranged in columns. The column headings would specify the categories of information being tracked, the type of cargo, its quantity measured in the unit standard to that trade, the originating estate or factor, the destination port, the ship's designation, and the projected date of arrival. Each entry would occupy a single ruled line, sometimes two, if the details required more space. The margins might contain a notation in a different hand, a later auditor's mark, a correction, a running total tallied at a later date when the received quantities were checked against what had been shipped. The final entries on such a roll, in the normal course of operations, would simply be the last entries that had been written before the roll was either dispatched to the central archive or set aside to begin a new roll when this one was full, on a roll whose completion was interrupted, not by the completion of the parchment, not by the dispatch to the archive, but by some external disruption of the clerical work that generated it. The final entries would trail off mid-page. The ruled lines below the last entry would be empty. The parchment below them would be blank. Nothing would explain the cessation, because the cessation was not something anyone anticipated writing an explanation for at the moment it occurred. This is the form in which the historical record of the La Rochelle fleet presents itself. Not a dramatic final notation, not a farewell. The entries simply stop, and the blank parchment that follows tells only the story of its own blankness. The wool trade that moved through La Rochelle connected the port to the English and Irish Templar estates that were among the order's most productive land holdings in the northwestern arc of its territory. The mechanics of this trade were straightforward in their basic structure, though complex in their administration. Wool was shorn from Templar flocks at the appropriate season, weighed and baled at the estate level under the oversight of the local preceptory's administrative staff, tallied against the estate's production records, and then transported by road or river to the nearest point of embarkation. From English ports it crossed to La Rochelle, where it was logged against the expected consignment, stored in the harbor warehouses, and eventually reshipped as part of larger consolidated cargo loads, moving south toward Iberian or Mediterranean markets. The margin between production cost and sale price, spread across the volume of Templar wool production in England and Ireland, generated revenues that were substantial rather than incidental. The wine trade worked along similar lines, though the directionality of its flow was generally the opposite. Templar vineyards in France and Iberia produced wine that was consumed within the order's own preceptories and commanderies, traded commercially, and occasionally used as cargo ballast on routes where the hold space would otherwise have been partially empty. The horses bred at Templar farms represented a different category of cargo, live, requiring dedicated space and care during transit, and high value enough that their transport was a matter of direct institutional interest rather than routine commercial activity. Horses bred for military use were expensive, and the Templars' reputation for maintaining quality breeding stock gave their horses a value on crusader markets that reflected both the physical quality of the animals and the institutional credibility of the source. All of this, the wool, the wine, the horses, the grain, the metalwork, the financial instruments moving between administrative centers, was the substance of what the La Rochelle harbor processed in the ordinary course of its operations. The compound's clerks knew the routes, they knew the vessels, they knew the cargo schedules and the seasonal rhythms of the trade, and the typical transit times between La Rochelle and the ports in its network. This was not knowledge that anyone had to make a special effort to acquire. It was simply the working knowledge of people who had been doing this work in this harbor for years. The Atlantic from the La Rochelle headland on a gray October morning is a particular gray-green, darker than the sky above it, running in long, low swells that have built across the open water to the west without obstruction. The color is not the color of a storm. It is the ordinary color of the late-season Atlantic, the water thickened and darkened by the autumn light that no longer reaches the surface at the angle that gives summer water its occasional blue. Standing at the headland, the harbor lies behind and below, its quayside visible as a line of stone running along the waterfront, the warehouse walls rising above it, the iron rings catching whatever light the gray sky offers. The water in the harbor is darker and stiller than the open water beyond the harbor mouth, protected from the swells by the geography of the bay, moving only with the slow rise and fall of the tide. If ships had been present in the harbor the night before, they would be visible from this headland at dawn. The masts of ocean-going vessels rise above the line of the warehouse roofs when they are at anchor in the harbor basin, and the rigging between the masts is distinctive enough to identify the presence of large vessels from a considerable distance. In the gray light of an October dawn, those masts would be among the most visible elements of the harbor from any elevated point on the surrounding headland. The Royal Inventory from October 1307 does not mention masts. It does not mention vessels. It records what was there. In the methodical administrative language of a survey conducted by officers whose job was to establish the value of what had been seized, and the category that would have contained the fleet is empty. What the officers found, the grain and livestock and household goods and modest coin, is listed in the inventories columns with the same flat precision that medieval administrative documents always brought to their work. The columns end. The document ends. The question of what occupied the empty category, and where it went, and when it went there, is not answered anywhere in the document, because the document is not a document that was designed to answer that question. It sits in a French archive now. This inventory, its parchment pages folded in a configuration that has held for centuries, its columns of entries faded but still legible to anyone with the training to read the medieval administrative script in which they were set down. The entries it contains are genuine and verifiable against other sources. The silence of its absent categories is equally genuine, equally verifiable against other sources, or rather against the absence of other sources, which is itself a kind of verification. The document says what was there. What was not there is established by the same inventory's failure to record it. 7 centuries is a long time for a document to keep its silence. The inventory from October 1307 has been in the archive for all of it, its blank categories, as present now as they were when the royal clerk who wrote it set down his pen and folded the parchment and handed it to whatever officer was responsible for the administrative custody of seized records. The parchment has not deteriorated to the point of unreadability. The entries are still there, the blanks are still there, neither is changed, and neither has told the historian anything that was not there to be read from the beginning. The La Rochelle harbor is a working port still. The medieval Templar compound is long gone, its stones incorporated into later structures, or simply vanished into the accumulated rebuilding that 6 centuries of active commercial port have required. The harbor has been extended and modernized across many subsequent periods, its configuration altered to serve the demands of successively larger vessels and successively more complex commercial operations. The iron mooring rings, if any survive, are buried under later construction or have been replaced. The water in the harbor basin is the same water, the same Atlantic, the same tidal rhythms, the same gray-green swell running in from the open water to the west on autumn mornings. The ships that operated from this harbor in the Templar period were ocean-going vessels capable of extended Atlantic voyages. They were built to carry substantial cargo loads across water that was not always cooperative. The Bay of Biscay, the Portuguese coast, the approaches to Gibraltar, and their crews knew those waters well enough to navigate them in conditions that less experienced mariners would have avoided. The Order's maritime operations out of La Rochelle were not an amateur undertaking. They were the product of accumulated institutional knowledge about Atlantic navigation, built across decades of regular commercial voyaging along the routes the records document. What any such vessel carried in its hold on any given voyage was a function of the commercial and logistical requirements of that voyage, and the administrative decisions made by whoever was responsible for cargo assignment at the originating port. A vessel departing La Rochelle on a southbound route to Lisbon might carry wool in its forward hold, wine casks stacked amidships, and financial instruments, letters of credit, debt registers, administrative documents, in sealed containers in the captain's cabin or a designated secure space within the ship's structure. The financial instruments were, in many respects, the most valuable things such a vessel could carry, because their value did not require the physical transport of gold, but represented claims on gold and silver that could be realized at the destination port or at any point in the order's network where the relevant counterparty was known. A debt register, a bound volume whose pages listed the names of noble and royal debtors, along with the sums owed and the terms of repayment, represented a claim on future revenue streams. Its physical size was modest, a book of folded parchment leaves that a man could carry under one arm. Its value was not contained in its physical substance, but in the information it recorded and the institutional authority that stood behind the claims it documented. If such a book disappeared, if it was not in the Paris Temple when the royal officers conducted their inventory, if it was not in the La Rochelle compound, if it was simply not in any location where Philip IV's officers could find it, then the debts it recorded would not disappear with it, because the debtors still owed what they had borrowed. But the mechanism for collecting those debts, the documented evidence of the obligations, would be gone, and the practical effect would be that the claims were unenforceable. The inventory of the La Rochelle compound from October 1307 sits in its French archive. Its columns of entries present and readable, the categories that should contain fleet records and financial instruments and gold reserves empty and silent, the parchment below the last written line, blank to the bottom of the page. The open Atlantic runs beyond the harbor mouth to the horizon, gray-green and unreadable, carrying nothing now that it did not carry before, holding in its depths and distances no answer to the question the empty columns ask. The question has been there since October 1307, exactly as specific and exactly as unresolved as it was when the royal clerk set down his pen and closed the inventory. The harbor was active, the routes were documented, the ships were present, and then they were not present, and the record of where they went exists, if it exists anywhere, in a document that no one has yet located in any archive that has been searched. The ships were simply gone. That is the full extent of what the available evidence confirms, and it is, in its quiet way, enough. The harbor returning to its gray October stillness, the water rising and falling against the empty pilings, the mooring rings holding nothing, the columns of the inventory ending where the clerk ended them, the blank parchment below, carrying only the particular silence of a record that stops before it reaches the thing the reader most wants to find. A sealed document rested on a wooden table in a provincial bailiff's office, somewhere in the French countryside, on the night of October 12th, 1307. The candle on the table was low, its flame bending slightly in the draught from a shuttered window, throwing warm light across the folded surface of the parchment. The wax seal was intact, Philip IV's device pressed into red wax, firm and unbroken, the impression clear enough to read by candlelight if one leaned close. The bailiff had received it days before, with instructions that were themselves unusual. The document was not to be opened until the hours before dawn on the following morning, not a minute sooner, not for any reason that presented itself in the interval. The parchment sat there through the evening. It sat there while the bailiff ate his supper, and while the fire in the adjacent room burned down to embers. It sat there while the house settled into the particular silence of a rural night in October, the fields beyond the walls already cold, the sky above the village clear and moonlit. Whatever administrative matter the bailiff might have attended to on a normal evening, this was not a normal evening, though he could not yet have known precisely what the folded document would require of him. He had been told only that it was urgent, that it was to be followed exactly, and that the timing was not a suggestion. Across France, on the same night, hundreds of identical documents rested on hundreds of identical tables. The scale of what Philip IV had organized in the preceding months was, by the standard of medieval administrative capacity, remarkable. A sealed order had been dispatched to every bailiff, every seneschal, every royal officer of consequence throughout the kingdom, each one carrying the same instructions, each one sealed with the same wax impression, each one prohibited from being read until the pre-dawn hours of October 13th. The coordination required to deliver that many documents simultaneously through a courier network crossing rivers and mountains, and the full breadth of French territory was itself a significant institutional accomplishment. Nothing about what was coming had been announced. Nothing had leaked, or if it had, nothing had reached the people who most needed the warning. The order, once opened, was direct. Every Templar within the officer's jurisdiction was to be arrested. Every Templar property was to be seized. The operation was to begin before sunrise and was to be completed as completely as possible before the day's business brought ordinary citizens into the streets. The charges were specified: heresy, apostasy, idolatry, and acts of obscenity conducted in secret within the order's chapter ceremonies. The theological gravity of the accusations was plain in the language. These were not ordinary criminal charges. Philip IV had been moving toward this moment for some time. The financial architecture of his reign had depended heavily on the Templars. The Paris Temple had functioned as the effective repository of French royal finances for decades, a position the order had occupied through a combination of institutional trust, practical capability, and geographic convenience. The order's network of preceptories, its experience with credit instruments, and its tradition of discretion had made it a natural custodian of funds that required both security and mobility. Philip had stored crown jewels in its vaults. He had drawn on its banking functions during periods when the French royal treasury could not meet immediate obligations. The relationship was long and structural rather than casual, and its unraveling when it came not from mutual erosion, but from an abrupt and total rupture initiated entirely from one side. The king's fiscal history in the years preceding October 13 Vexenfurzeven offered some context for the shape of that rupture. Philip had expelled the Jewish population of France in 1306, simultaneously seizing their assets and canceling the debts owed to Jewish creditors throughout the kingdom, a maneuver that generated significant immediate revenue while destroying the financial relationships it terminated. The logic of the action, whatever its moral weight, was recognizable as a pattern: identify a creditor class, invalidate its claims, absorb its holdings. The Templars were a far larger target by any measure. Their documented holdings across France alone dwarfed what the expulsion of 1306 had produced. Their debt registers contained claims on noble and royal revenues throughout Europe. And Philip had a personal grievance that was not reducible to finance. He had at some point earlier in his reign sought membership in the order and been refused, a rejection that carried a particular sting for a king accustomed to having his preferences treated as directives. The charges Philip's inquisitors brought were detailed in their specificity and almost entirely dependent, for their supporting testimony, on confessions obtained under conditions that the inquisitorial records themselves noted with the phrase meaning the application of torment. Modern historians working through the trial transcripts have been essentially unanimous in their assessment. The charges were fabricated or drawn from misunderstandings of Templar ceremony, so distorted by coercive questioning as to bear no recognizable relationship to actual practice. The denial of Christ alleged to occur at Templar initiations, the worship of an idol called Baphomet, the ritual obscenities. No independent corroborating evidence for any of these was produced outside the coerced depositions. No non-Templar witness testified to having observed these practices. No physical evidence of idolatry was found in the searches of Templar properties. The idol that featured in so many of the extracted confessions was never located, because no description of it was consistent enough across different testimonies to suggest it referred to any real object. What the charges accomplished, however, was not a matter of their evidentiary quality. They accomplished what Philip needed them to accomplish, which was the provision of a theological framework for the suppression of an institution that could not have been suppressed on purely financial grounds. A king could not simply announce that he was dissolving a papally chartered military order because it held documents recording debts he preferred not to honor. The machinery of medieval ecclesiastical law required a cause commensurate with the consequence being sought. Heresy was that cause. It was serious enough to warrant dissolution, serious enough to justify asset seizure, serious enough to override the protections that a century and a half of papal privilege had built around the order's finances and independence. The pre-dawn arrests on October 13th, 1307, moved with the precision that the sealed orders had organized. In Paris, where the operation was most consequential, royal officers assembled outside the gates of the temple enclosure in the hours before first light. The compound, which occupied a substantial fortified space in the Marais district of the city, was still lit from within. The household had not yet gone to sleep, or had risen early, or was simply conducting the ordinary overnight operations of a large administrative establishment. The gates were approached and the orders presented. Whatever resistance was offered or contemplated was not of a kind that slowed the entry. Jacques de Molay, the 23rd and final Grand Master of the Knights Templar, was arrested in those early morning hours. He was approximately 60 years old. He had led the order for more than a decade through the continued erosion of the Crusader position in the Holy Land following the fall of Acre in 1291, a military catastrophe that had removed the order's primary stated justification and left it as a European financial institution with a warrior identity that no longer had a theater of operation. De Molay had been attempting, in the years before the arrests, to persuade the papacy to authorize a new crusade, partly because he genuinely believed in the enterprise, and partly because a restored military purpose would have answered the growing criticism that an order of soldiers with nowhere to soldier had become an anomaly. The new crusade had not materialized. The timing of his arrest carried a particular quality that the historical record preserves without amplification. De Molay had been a guest of honor at a royal funeral in Paris just days before October 13th. Philip IV had been present at the same ceremony, and de Molay had served as a pallbearer. The two men had stood near each other in the formal context of shared mourning, and whatever private knowledge Philip already held about the orders he had already dispatched, no sign of it had disturbed the surface of the occasion. De Molay had attended, performed his ceremonial role, and returned to the temple compound with no reason evident to him that the relationship between the order and the French crown was in a different condition than it had been the week before. He was led through a stone corridor in a Paris royal prison in the early morning of October 13th, his white mantle taken from him. The corridor was narrow and lit at the far end by a single wall torch. The administrative fact of that removal, a Grand Master of a papally chartered military order, stripped of his habit and placed in a French royal prison, represented something that had not existed in the institutional landscape of Christendom for the 188 years since the order's formal recognition. No mechanism existed for what Philip had done, because no one had anticipated the need for one. The order had simply been assumed to be permanent, in the way that permanent-seeming institutions are assumed to be permanent until the morning they are not. The inquisitorial proceedings that followed the arrests were conducted by Guillaume de Paris, the king's confessor, who also happened to hold the position of Inquisitor of France, an overlap of royal service and ecclesiastical authority that made any boundary between Philip's interests and the Inquisition's findings difficult to locate. Sessions were recorded in a court hand, the questions written in one ink, and the answers in another, the marginal notations indicating the conditions under which the session had proceeded. Many of those notations were brief and procedural, a record that a given session had included what the documents called the use of torment. The questions were standardized and repetitive. Did the witness deny Christ at his initiation? Was an idol present in the chapter house? Were certain acts performed? The structure of the questioning was designed to produce particular answers, and under the conditions applied, it largely did. 60 senior officers of the order were arrested in Paris alongside de Molay, and the arrests continued in the days that followed across the rest of France. The total number of Templars taken into custody across the kingdom ran into the hundreds. Some escaped before the sweep reached them. Some were not found in their preceptories on the morning of October 13th, for reasons that the records do not explain. The sealed orders had been coordinated across a vast administrative territory, and any coordination of that scale across medieval road networks and variable local conditions will have produced gaps. But the primary target, the leadership of the order within France and the institution's French properties, was effectively captured in a single morning. Pope Clement V occupied a position during this period that the record describes with a careful neutrality, which itself requires some attention. He was not residing in Rome. The papacy had been established at Poitiers following a period of intense conflict between Philip IV and Clement's predecessor, Boniface VIII, a conflict that had ended with Boniface's death and the election of a French pope who remained throughout his pontificate in France rather than returning to the traditional Roman seat of papal authority. Poitiers was not far from Paris in the scale of medieval European geography. The conditions of Clement's residence were not those of an independent sovereign operating at a comfortable remove from French royal pressure. When Philip's arrests began on October 13th, Clement had not been consulted. The Templars were a papally chartered institution. Their suppression was, by any canonical reading, a matter that should have been initiated by Rome, not by a French king acting through his own inquisitor. Philip's seizure of Templar properties within France was, in strict canonical terms, an act taken against institutions that were accountable to the Holy See, not to the French crown. Clement protested, in the days immediately following the arrests, that he had not been informed and that the action had exceeded Philip's authority. The protest was recorded. It did not alter anything that had already been done. What followed the initial protest was a gradual accommodation that produced one of the most significant papal documents of the period. On November 22, 1307, 40 days after the arrests, Clement issued the bull Pastoralis Preeminentia, directing all Christian monarchs to arrest Templars and seize their assets. The bull did not say that Philip had acted correctly. It did not formally ratify the specific charges. What it did was extend the arrests from a French royal action to a continent-wide ecclesiastical directive, transforming what Philip had done unilaterally into a coordinated institutional response across all of Christendom. Monarchs in England, Iberia, Italy, and the German lands received the directive. Some followed it promptly, some with reluctance, some with a thoroughness matching the French operation, and some with a deliberateness that allowed time to pass before the order reached anyone within their borders. The bull itself was a physical document of some weight. Its text ran to considerable length in the dense ecclesiastical Latin of its period, setting out the charges, summarizing the evidence as Philip's inquisitors had produced it, and directing the action to be taken. The heavy lead seal at its foot hung on a plated cord, the leaden bulla from which such documents derive their name, bearing on one face the image of Saints Peter and Paul, and on the other the name of the issuing pope. The seal guaranteed authenticity. It confirmed that the document carried the authority of the Holy See and was not a forgery or a local fabrication. It sat heavily when the document was held, and when the document rested flat on a writing table, the seal pulled gently at the cord, a physical reminder of the institutional weight behind what the text commanded. In Clement's chambers at Poitiers in November 1307, the window would have shown the gray sky of a French autumn, the light flat and low in the way that light in northern France is flat and low in the weeks before winter. The text of Pastorellus Praeminentiae lay on the writing table, its columns of ecclesiastical Latin dense and precise, the word praeminentiae, preeminence, carrying in its usage an implicit argument that the papacy, by taking charge of what Philip had begun, was asserting its authority over the matter rather than simply ratifying a royal decision. Whether that reading was felt as a genuine reassertion of independence or simply as a diplomatic face-saving device embedded in the language of the bull is a question the document does not answer, and that Clement's own later actions do not resolve with any clarity. The response to Pastorellus Praeminentia outside France was varied in ways that said something about the actual distribution of royal power and papal authority at the opening of the 14th century. In England, Edward II initially resisted, finding the charges implausible, before eventually complying. In Portugal, King Dinas I moved more carefully, conducting inquiries that reached conclusions at variance with those reached in France. In parts of the Holy Roman Empire, local ecclesiastical authorities found insufficient evidence to proceed. The universality implied by the papal bull was, in practice, uneven, but the direction of the movement was consistent. By the end of 1307 and through the months of 1308, Templar houses across Europe had been secured, their occupants detained or scattered, their properties under the nominal control of royal or ecclesiastical administrators. The inquisitorial records from this period have a particular texture that is worth attending to, not for what they prove about the charges, but for what they reveal about the mechanics of the process. A transcript page from a Templar proceeding shows the questions in a formal court hand, evenly spaced, the standard series repeated with minimal variation from one session to the next. The answers appear below in a different ink and often in a different hand, the record of a notary who wrote what the witness said, or was understood to have said, or was later determined to have confirmed. A marginal notation in a third hand, brief and procedural, indicates the conditions of the session. The page is a bureaucratic document of medieval judicial process. It is also, read carefully, a record of how certainty was manufactured out of conditions that were not designed to produce accurate testimony. De Molay himself confessed under examination, admitting to denying Christ at his initiation. He later retracted the confession, and then retracted the retraction, and then maintained his guilt before a public commission in 1310, before eventually, in March 1314, retracting everything and declaring himself and the order innocent before the cardinals who had come to pronounce final sentence. His retraction in 1314 was the act that sealed his fate. A relapsed heretic who withdrew a confession was beyond the protections of penance and was subject to burning. He was burned at the stake in Paris on the evening of March 18th, 1314, on an island in the Seine. The record of the event is brief and institutional. The act is noted. The duration is not given. The responses of those present are not recorded. What the record does preserve from this period, alongside the trial documents and the papal bulls, is a set of silences that have drawn as much attention as the documented events. The inventory of the Paris Temple, conducted by royal officers in the days following October 13th, recorded the contents of what had been the most significant financial institution in the Kingdom of France. The columns of entries accounted for grain and storage, livestock in the compound's outbuildings, household furniture, modest quantities of coin. The section where the order's gold reserves, silver bullion, and financial instruments would have appeared contained no entries of consequence. What royal officers found in the vaults of the Paris Temple, once they had the keys, was not what anyone who understood the order's documented financial position had expected to find. The question that absence raised, and raises still, is not one that the record of the suppression answers. The charges in Philip's sealed orders had been prepared in advance. The arrests had been coordinated across the kingdom with exceptional administrative care. Everything about the operation suggests planning that accounted for what was expected to be found, and the expectation would have been informed by knowledge of the order's finances that Philip possessed from his own use of the temple as a royal treasury. The discrepancy between what was expected and what was found is not a minor bookkeeping anomaly. It is a gap at the center of the operation's financial logic, recorded in the inventory itself by the absence of entries that should have been there. The sealed orders that had traveled to every corner of France and arrived at every bailiff's table on the night of October 12th had accomplished their institutional purpose with precision. The Templars within France had been arrested. Their properties had been seized. Their leadership was in royal custody. Philip had the charges, the papal ratification, and the physical control of the order's fixed assets. What he did not have, the inventory confirmed, was the wealth that had made the operation worth undertaking. The mechanism had worked. The vault was empty. Clement V's writing table in Poitiers, on the day in November 1307, when the completed bull was ready to be sent out, held a document whose consequences would travel farther and faster than its drafter could have calculated. The lead seal hung on its cord. The text directed every Christian monarch to act. The window behind it showed the gray French sky, and the light in the room was the flat, particular light of a late autumn morning in a country that does not warm quickly once the cold has arrived. The candles on the table supplemented the daylight without replacing it. The document lay open, its columns of dense Latin visible, its instructions plain, its authority established by the seal and by the name at its head. A document signed by one man in a French city, in a room that no longer exists, set in motion the arrest of thousands of people across a continent. The properties of an institution that had existed for nearly 2 centuries changed hands in the course of weeks. The financial architecture that had underpinned the credit relationships of European monarchs was abruptly dissolved, and the debt registers that recorded what was owed to the order disappeared from the places where they should have been found. The inquisitorial proceedings produced their confessions and their retractions. The charges were recorded and the verdicts rendered. The machinery of medieval administrative power had turned with a precision and a scale that few institutions of the period could have matched. And yet the specific thing that had motivated the machinery's turning, the accumulated wealth of an order that had operated as Europe's primary financial institution for generations, remained and remains unaccounted for. The inventory was complete. Its entries were accurate as far as they went. What the inventory did not contain was a record of where the order's movable wealth had gone before the morning of October 13th, and neither the trial proceedings, nor the papal documents, nor the royal correspondence of the following years provides an entry that fills the gap. The mechanism had been executed with exceptional precision. The result was not what the precision was designed to produce. The bull Pastoralis Preeminentiae rested in Clement's chambers, its seal heavy on the cord, its text directing action across all of Christendom. In the Paris temple, the royal clerks had closed the inventory ledger and noted their entries in the official record. Somewhere on the roads outside Paris and outside 100 provincial towns, where the sealed orders had arrived unopened on the night before, the administrative correspondence of the operation was already moving back toward the capital, carrying the first reports of what had been found and what had not. The answer to the question that would recur in archives and in libraries for the next 7 centuries was already not there. Philip IV had built no treasury of his own, having relied on the institution he had just suppressed to serve that function. The crown jewels, which had been stored in the temple's vaulted rooms, were now in French royal custody, accounted for in their proper place in the inventory. The modest coin found in the compound's storerooms had been transferred to royal administration. The fixed properties across France, the manors and preceptories and commanderies that the order had accumulated over a century and a half, were now in the process of being inventoried and administered. The institutional skeleton of what had been the Templars was in French royal hands. The flesh of it, the movable wealth, the debt registers, the financial instruments, the gold and silver, whose scale had been a matter of documented public knowledge for generations, was not. The candle on the bailiff's table in the provincial town had burned down through the night of October 12th, its light diminishing as the hours passed, and the wax seal on the document remained intact. In the pre-dawn hours, the seal was broken, the document unfolded, and the instructions read. The same action was being performed at roughly the same moment in hundreds of offices across France, the documents opening in sequence as the hours moved and the instructions took effect. The coordination was precise. The moment was simultaneous. The operation was, in its logistical design, as complete as the administrative capacity of the period allowed. What it could not capture was what had already left. The inventory recorded what was present. The record of what was absent speaks in the language of blank columns and entries that simply are not there, a silence in the ledger that is, in its way, as legible as text, more legible, perhaps, because it does not require interpretation, only attention. The column is blank. The line where the sum should appear contains no sum. The vault was opened, and the vault was empty, and the royal clerks who recorded the contents of an institution that had functioned as the center of French royal finance for decades wrote down in their careful court hand the modest totals that the room actually contained. In a room in Poitiers, the bowl lay open on the writing table. Its lead seal rested against the wood. Outside the window, the gray French sky continued in every direction, uninterrupted, the same sky that lay over Paris and over the roads leading out of La Rochelle and over the Midlothian hills and over the Atlantic beyond the headlands of the Portuguese coast. The document's instructions were clear, and its authority was established, and its consequences were already in motion. What the document did not address, because no document of the period addressed it, was the question of where the wealth of the suppressed institution had gone before the morning that the sealed orders were opened, and the mechanism was set in motion. The answer to that question did not arrive with the confessions. It did not arrive with the asset transfers. It did not arrive in any of the correspondence between Philip and Clement in the months that followed the arrests, or in the papal records of the Council of Vienne, where the order was formally dissolved 5 years later, or in any instrument of the subsequent transfer of Templar properties to other institutions. The record of what happened to the movable wealth of the Knights Templar begins with the inventory that found nothing, and it ends in the official archive at exactly the same point where it begins, with a silence that the documents around it do not explain. Pastoralis Preeminentiae lay on the writing table in Clement's chambers, its lead seal cool against the wood surface, its columns of Latin dense and precise. The gray sky was visible through the window. The light in the room was the light of a November morning in the early 14th century in France, flat and even and without particular warmth. The document had done what it was designed to do, and what it was designed to do had been accomplished across a continent in the weeks that followed. The institution it addressed had been suppressed. The wealth it was partly designed to secure remained unlocated in the record, as it had been from the morning of the arrests, the question sitting precisely where it had always been, in the blank space of an inventory column, in the absence of entries that should have been made and were not, in the silence that the archive maintains around a fortune that the documents confirm existed and that no document has ever explained. The ledger closed at a particular hour on the morning of October 14th, 1307. A royal clerk set down his pen inside the Paris temple, gathered the pages of the inventory he had completed, and bound them with a cord. The entries were methodical. They were also, when set against everything the kingdom had expected to find inside those vaulted walls, remarkably quiet. Grain was recorded in measured quantities. Livestock were counted and noted. Household goods, tables, candle holders, lengths of cloth, the ordinary furnishings of a large institutional building, received their columns and their figures. Modest coin appeared in the record, the kind of sum a well-run preceptory might keep for daily expenses, not the kind that moves the finances of a kingdom. The clerk's hand moved steadily across the page, and then the entries ended, in the way that inventories end when there is nothing further to record, without drama, without notation, without any acknowledgement of what was conspicuously absent from every line of the accounting. Philip IV had expected more. That expectation is embedded in the historical record, not as a statement the king made in writing, but as an inference from everything that preceded the arrests, the years of mounting royal debt, the loans the Templars held against crown revenues, the deposits placed within the temple's walls, the financial weight the order had accumulated across nearly 2 centuries of papal exemption and institutional growth. The gap between what the inventories recorded and what the order's documented economic power implied has driven scholarly attention for 7 centuries, not because the gap is inexplicable, but because it is complete. There is no partial accounting, no ledger showing some portion of what the order held. There is only the record of what was found, ending where the significant entries should have begun. The Templars' movable wealth was not, in its nature, the kind of fortune that sits in a single room waiting to be counted. It was distributed, institutional, and partially abstract, the kind of wealth that exists in documents as much as in metal. Gold and silver bullion were certainly part of it. Liturgical objects of precious metal, altar fittings, reliquaries, the kind of portable sacred property a military religious order accumulates across generations of patronage and donation. These were present in the Paris temple in the days before the arrests and absent from the inventory afterward. Sacred relics, among them what the order maintained was a fragment of the true cross, had been among its most valued portable possessions, objects whose spiritual and symbolic worth to medieval Christendom was not easily separated from their material presence. None of these appear in the October 1307 accounting. Then there were the debt registers. A Templar debt register was a bound book of parchment leaves, each page ruled into columns, each column carrying the name of a debtor, a noble house, a merchant, a king, alongside the sum owed and the terms of the obligation. These documents were financial instruments in the precise sense. They represented, in their physical form, claims on revenue. A loan to a king was not an abstract arrangement. It was a written record held by the lender, whose destruction or disappearance would permanently extinguish the obligation it documented. The debt registers inside the Paris Temple, the morning of October 13th, 1307, contained entries representing loans to sovereigns and noble families across Europe, obligations whose total value, compounded across the order's entire administrative network, would have dwarfed the modest figures the royal inventory was capable of producing. Those registers have never been identified in any subsequent archive. No document that has been found records their seizure, their destruction, or their transfer to any institution that succeeded the Templars in handling royal financial accounts. They are absent from the record in the same complete way the bullion is absent, not partially accounted for, not distributed and traceable, simply not present in any document that has come to light. The silence of the record is a specific kind of evidence. It does not confirm what happened. It establishes the shape of what is not known, the perimeter of the question, the place where the archive ends and inference begins. For most of the 7 centuries that have elapsed since those inventories were compiled, scholars have worked from that silence, examining the physical record around its edges, looking for documents that touch the missing wealth without directly describing it, finding in the occasional peripheral reference some hint of the larger question's dimensions without arriving at an answer. One such document did not become accessible to outside researchers until 2001. The Chinon parchment is a long strip of vellum rolled and tied as it was left in the Vatican's secret archives at some point in the 17th century, when it was separated from the Vatican registers in which it had previously rested and placed in a collection that was not catalogued with the precision of the main archive. Its text is written in a cramped medieval hand, the kind of administrative Latin that favors compression over clarity, and it records a series of proceedings conducted at the castle of Chinon in August 1308, nearly a year after the arrests. The document is a record of the secret trial at which Pope Clement V, acting through 3 of his cardinals, examined Jacques de Molay and 4 other senior Templar leaders, and then granted them absolution. The historian Barber Frele located it in 2001. Its contents, when they became known, required a careful revision of what the public record of the suppression had been taken to mean. The Chinon parchment establishes that Clement V privately concluded the Templar leaders were guilty of certain internal irregularities, lapses from correct religious observance, practices that had become corrupt within the order's own customs, but not of the heresy and apostasy that Philip IV's inquisitors were simultaneously extracting in confession after confession in the dungeons of the French royal prison system. The absolution was real. The document bearing the papal seal at its foot confirmed that Clement believed the men before him to be redeemable, not condemned. This private conclusion was conducted in complete separation from the public proceedings Philip was directing. What the king was producing, the confessions, the charges, the institutional case for suppression, and what the Pope privately determined were not merely different in emphasis. They were contradictory accounts of the same institution and the same men, one shaped by torture and political necessity, one conducted in private and then sealed and filed where it would remain unread for centuries. The parchment says nothing about treasure. It does not record a conversation about the order's wealth, the missing fleet, the absent bullion, the debt registers that were not in the Paris temple when the inventory was completed. What it establishes, with the specificity of a primary source, is that the official proceedings against the Templars were not what they presented themselves to be, that the highest ecclesiastical authority involved privately held a view of the order's guilt directly contrary to the view the institution was publicly advancing. That gap between public record and private determination is itself a document, one that invites attention to the other gaps the suppression produced, including the one that runs through the center of the October 1307 inventory. The Council of Vienne convened in the autumn of 1311. It was a general council of the Church, attended by prelates from across Christendom, and one of its principal items of business was the formal disposition of the question Philip IV had forced into the ecclesiastical record 4 years earlier. The matter of the Knights Templar required resolution in canonical terms. Clement V could not simply allow the proceedings to drift forward indefinitely. The question of the order's guilt, its suppression, and the redistribution of its properties needed to be settled in a form the Church could formally maintain. The bull Vox in Excelso, issued on March 22, 1312, accomplished that settlement by a method that preserved something of Clement's private position while satisfying Philip's political requirements. The word at the center of the bull is suppressimus. The order was suppressed, not condemned by judicial verdict, but dissolved by apostolic provision. The distinction matters canonically. A verdict of guilt would have required the proceedings to sustain the charges. In Clement's private view, as the Chinon parchment records, was that the charges as Philip had framed them could not be sustained. Apostolic provision required no such finding. The Pope, acting in his capacity as supreme authority over religious institutions, could dissolve an order without pronouncing it heretical. Vox in Excels accomplished exactly this, and the order that had existed since 1129, that had operated across 9,000 manors and preceptories, that had developed one of the earliest credit transfer mechanisms in Western history, that order ceased to exist in the canonical record on the morning the bull was promulgated, without a formal finding of the charges against it, and without any instrument addressing the portion of its wealth that had not been located. The bull ad privatum followed, and it handled the order's known assets with the orderly specificity that canonical instruments are designed to produce. Templar properties throughout Europe were transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, the land holdings, the preceptories, the manors, the fixed assets whose existence was documented in the order's own administrative records and confirmed in the royal inventories that had been compiled across the preceding years. The redistribution was not instantaneous. National variations complicated the transfer in Portugal and in Castile and in several other kingdoms, and the process of actual physical handover continued for years after the bulls were issued. But the legal instrument was precise. It accounted for what could be located, what had been inventoried, what existed in the form of buildings and land, and documented revenues from agricultural holdings. No corresponding instrument addressed the movable wealth absent from the October 1307 inventories. Ad privatum closes without any notation corresponding to missing bullion, to debt registers unlocated in the Paris temple, to the fleet of ships that the harbor master's records at La Rochelle would have been expected to document. The silence of the bull on these matters is not in itself proof that Philip IV's treasury was aware of what was missing. It is possible the absence of significant gold from the Paris Temple inventory was not interpreted by the royal clerks as evidence of deliberate removal. The order's financial operations were distributed across an enormous geographic range, and it would not have been straightforward in October 1307 to calculate precisely what the Paris Temple should have held on any given morning. The discrepancy between the order's documented economic power and the poverty of the hall may have become apparent only slowly, as inventories from other commanderies were compiled and compared, and as the pattern of consistent absence began to outline the dimensions of what had moved. By that point, the order's leadership was in prison. Jacques de Molay was held in a French royal dungeon from October 1307 onward, with a brief interval during which he was transferred to papal custody before being returned to Philip's effective control. The men who would have known the full scope of the order's financial arrangements, the treasurer, the seneschals responsible for major preceptories, the officials who managed the debt registers, were either imprisoned alongside him or had departed before the arrests. The knowledge of where the movable wealth had gone, if it went anywhere deliberately, resided in a group of men who were no longer in a position to provide an account of it. The record of what the Paris Temple held before October 13th, 1307, exists in pieces. There are references in prior year documents to the crown jewels Philip IV stored within its vaults. There are entries in earlier Templar administrative records that speak to the order's general financial operations without specifying the quantities of coin or bullion held at any given time. There are descriptions from visitors to the Paris Temple that convey the compound's institutional scale and its character as a place where significant financial transactions routinely took place. None of these references translates into a specific figure for what should have been there on the morning the royal clerks arrived with their ledgers. The gap in the October 1307 inventory cannot be measured precisely against a prior inventory that has survived in the archive, because no such prior inventory has been located. The discrepancy is documented not as a specific difference between two numbers, but as the absence of the kind of wealth the order was documented to control, from a place where that wealth should reasonably have been. One Templar reliquary remains in the imagination of this question with particular persistence. The reliquaries of a major Templar house were not merely devotional objects. They were part of the order's identity and its public function. The physical presence of sacred items within the temple's walls was consistent with its character as a military religious institution operating at the intersection of warfare, finance, and liturgy. A reliquary of gilded wood and enamel, the kind that would have rested on an altar inside the Paris Temple's chapel, was among the category of portable sacred objects that the order had accumulated across its 2 centuries of operation. The chapel of the Paris Temple was a functioning space of worship, attended by the knights and lay brothers of the order, and its furnishings included the kind of precious objects that patrons donated and that preceptories accumulated through long years of pious gift-giving. None of these objects appear in the October 1307 inventory. Their last documented location was somewhere inside the Paris Temple before the morning the royal officers arrived. The category of genuinely unaccounted for is the category these objects occupy in the historical record. This is not the same as the category of the lost, which implies a known quantity that went somewhere unknown. It is also not the same as the category of the destroyed, which would require some evidence of destruction. The genuinely unaccounted for is a classification the archive creates by its own silence, by the absence of the entry that should be there, the column that should carry a figure and carries nothing, the document that should exist at the other end of a financial operation and has never been found. The trial of Jacques de Molay extended over 7 years, from his arrest in October 1307 to his death in March 1314. During those years, the proceedings produced an enormous volume of documentary record, testimony transcripts, inquisitorial session accounts, papal correspondence, royal decrees. The archive of the suppression is among the more extensively documented episodes in medieval institutional history, which makes the central silence inside it more legible rather than less. There is no shortage of paper. There is a shortage of the specific entries that would answer the most pressing financial question the suppression raised. A transcript of a Templar inquisitorial proceeding from this period carries its questions in a court hand, the regular institutional script of a trained notary, each question followed by space for the response, each response recorded in a slightly different ink that suggests the sessions were transcribed, at least partly from notes taken in the room. Marginal notations appear at intervals, brief administrative references to the conditions of the session, to whether certain responses were provided freely or under other circumstances. These notations are not vivid. They are the bureaucratic record of a judicial process, and they carry the same flat institutional tone as every other element of the Templar suppression's documentary trail. What they establish, without requiring any amplification, is that the confessions the proceedings produced were not the product of unconstrained testimony. Modern historians who have examined this record with care have been nearly unanimous in the view that what the inquisitorial transcripts record is not a reliable account of what the Templars believed or practiced, but an account of what men under sustained pressure would eventually confirm when confirmation was the only available path forward. Those transcripts have been studied extensively. They reveal a great deal about the mechanics of the suppression and relatively little about where the order's movable wealth went. Witnesses under inquisitorial examination were not asked about financial arrangements in a way that has produced a direct answer. The proceedings were designed to produce evidence for the charges Philip had constructed, the ritual denials, the accusations of idol worship, the claims of obscene ceremony, not to conduct a forensic accounting of the Paris temple's vaults. If the inquisitors asked about the wealth, those sessions have not surfaced in the documents that researchers have identified and examined. The financial question and the judicial question ran on parallel tracks across 7 years of proceedings, and only the judicial track left a full archival trace. What that means for the present question is that the most thoroughly documented episode in the Templars' institutional life is also the episode from which the clearest financial answers are absent. The suppression generated documents in enormous quantities. Those documents are preserved across multiple archives, French royal, papal, ecclesiastical, notarial, in several countries. Scholars have been reading them for centuries. The inventory of the Paris Temple from October 1307 is among the most examined documents in the entire collection, and the column where the significant entries should appear remains blank, exactly as it was the morning the royal clerk closed the ledger and bound the pages with a cord. The Chinon parchment rested in the Vatican's secret archives for nearly 700 years after Clement V's cardinals completed their proceedings at the castle of Chinon in August 1308. It was not hidden in any active sense. It was misclassified and unfiled in the main registers, lost within the archive's own organizational history, rather than deliberately removed from it. When Barbara Frele identified it in 2001 and brought its contents to scholarly attention, It required a recalibration of what the suppression had been understood to mean. Not a total revision. The broad outlines had been established by the documentary record already known, but a specific adjustment to the question of Clement's private position and the relationship between that position and the public record of the trials. The parchment's existence raises, by implication, the question of what other documents from this period might occupy a similar position, filed in an archive, accessible in principle, not yet located by researchers who did not know to look for them. The Vatican's secret archives contain an enormous volume of medieval material. Not all of it has been systematically cataloged to the level of detail that would permit a researcher to identify a specific document without first knowing it should exist. The financial records of the Templar suppression, if they were transmitted to Rome in the form of reports or summaries, would have entered the papal archive through the same administrative channels that received the judicial proceedings and the correspondence between Clement and Philip. Whether those records survive, and whether they contain anything bearing on the question the October 1307 inventory leaves open, is a question the archive has not yet answered. This is the character of the question as the historical record leaves it, not a mystery waiting to be solved through a discovery that would settle it permanently, but a question whose edges are documented and whose center remains open in the specific patient way that archival gaps remain open, present in the record as an absence, located precisely where the entries should be, unchanged for 7 centuries, neither growing nor diminishing, simply there in the form of a blank where a figure would be expected. The debt registers that were not in the Paris temple when the inventory was completed have no documented final location. The bullion that the order's financial operations implied should have been present in its principal Northern European preceptory does not appear in the record of what was seized. The liturgical objects and reliquaries of the Paris Temple's chapel are absent from the October 1307, accounting in the same complete way as the larger financial instruments. The fleet that operated from the Templars' Atlantic port facility is not listed in the inventory of that compound's contents following the arrests. These absences are not equally documented. Some rest on stronger archival foundations than others, and the degree of certainty that each item was present before the arrests varies with the specificity of the prior documentation, but they occupy the same category in the historical record, the genuinely unaccounted for, things the archive cannot place after October 13th, 1307. The bull Vox and Excel suppressed the order in March 1312. Ad Providum transferred the known properties to the Hospitallers in the same month. Jacques de Molay was burned on a small island in the Seine in March 1314 after retracting the confessions he had made under inquisitorial examination and reasserting before the crowd gathered on the riverbank that the order was innocent and his confession forced. Philip IV died in November 1314, 8 months later. Clement V died in April 1314, 1 month after de Molay. The 3 men whose intersection had produced the suppression were all dead within a year of the Grand Master's execution, and the question of the missing wealth outlasted all of them and passed into the custody of the archives they had collectively generated. Those archives have been read, copied, translated, and analyzed across the centuries that followed. The documentary record of the suppression is one of the best studied bodies of medieval institutional history in existence. The specific question at its center, what happened to the portion of the Templar fortune that does not appear in the October 1307 inventories, has not been answered by that study. It has been better described, more precisely located within the record, more carefully distinguished from the theories that have accumulated around it over the centuries. The distinction between a genuine archival gap and a popular mystery embellished beyond its evidential basis, is itself a scholarly achievement. To know with precision what is not known, to identify exactly where the record goes quiet and why that specific silence is significant, this is a form of knowledge about the question even in the absence of an answer. The Shannon parchment lies rolled in the Vatican's secret archives, its contents now known to scholars and available in published form, its implications still being worked through in the literature on the Templar suppression. Its discovery in 2001 did not resolve the financial question. It deepened the understanding of the suppression's internal contradictions, and it confirmed that the gap between Clement V's private determinations and the public record of the trials was more complete than the prior documentary evidence had established. A document that kept its secret not by being hidden, but by remaining unread in a drawer for nearly 7 centuries, has more to tell the historical record than its specific contents. It tells the record that the archive is not yet finished, that the questions sitting within it are not yet exhausted by the scholarship already conducted. The ledger from October 14th, 1307, is also still in the archive. Its columns end where they end. The cord binding its pages is no longer the original cord, but the pages are the same pages the royal clerk completed on that morning in the Paris temple, in the quiet of a room whose vaults had recently been examined and found to contain less than expected. The clerk recorded what was there. He had no instrument for recording what was absent. The absence took care of itself in the way that absences do, not by being noted in the margin, not by receiving a notation in a different ink, but by occupying the space below the last entry, silent and permanent, waiting in the record for the question that would eventually be asked of it. The question has been asked many times. The record has answered each time in the same way. Here is what was found. Here is where the entries end. Here is the silence that sits below them. Unchanged from the morning it was created, the column still blank, the figure that should fill it, still absent from every document in every archive that has been opened and read in all the centuries since. The churchyard at the village of Temple in Midlothian sits low in the landscape, enclosed by stone walls whose mortar has gone gray and soft with age and Scottish rain. The grave markers lean at gradual angles, their carved surfaces worn by centuries of weather into something between stone and suggestion. The original letters still legible in some places, and in others dissolved entirely into the surface from which they were cut. On a gray autumn morning, the field between the markers is quiet, the grass long enough to move in the wind off the hills, the low walls of what once stood as a functioning preceptory reduced to foundation courses and occasional upright courses that end without explanation, nothing above them. The air above the stones simply open. This was Ballantradoc. The name survives in the historical record as the principal Scottish seat of the Knights Templar, a working preceptory that maintained the order's administrative and agricultural functions in the northern kingdom from the mid-12th century onward. The village that now occupies the ground took a different name. It is called Temple. The name was not chosen at random, and it was not chosen recently. The village has carried it long enough that the designation itself has become a kind of archaeological record, an annotation in the landscape that says something happened here, something associated with that word, before the village or the quiet churchyard or the weathered grave markers existed in their present form. Archaeologists have worked the site at intervals over several generations, and the results of those excavations are documented, cataloged, and held in institutional collections. What they recovered from the ground at Ballantradoc is consistent in every respect with a functioning medieval preceptory of the kind the Templars maintained across England, Ireland, France, and the Iberian kingdoms, architectural fragments from the original buildings, dressed stone from what appear to have been chapel walls, grave markers bearing the simple incised crosses that appear in Templar burial contexts elsewhere in Europe, and the material culture of a community that maintained itself in this location across a sustained period of medieval occupation. The archaeology says, plainly and in its own language, that something real was here. What the archaeology does not say is equally plain. No concealed vault has been found at Dock. No evidence of an emergency deposit or deliberate burial of portable wealth has been recovered from the site. The soil beneath the grass of the churchyard has not produced, in any of the excavations undertaken there, any indication that the ground was disturbed in the early autumn of 1307, in a manner consistent with rapid concealment of objects of value. The record of what the excavations found is detailed. The record of what they did not find is in its own way just as complete. The reason Scotland appears in discussions of the Templar treasury at all rests on a particular historical circumstance that can be stated accurately and held there without requiring it to carry more weight than the documents support. Robert the Bruce, King of Scots, had been excommunicated by Pope Clement V in 1306, the year before the mass arrests, in connection with the murder of John Comyn, a killing that had taken place in a church which compounded its severity under canon law. The excommunication placed Scotland in a relationship with papal authority that was, to say the least, complicated. When Clement issued Pastoralis Praemunentia in November of 1307, directing all Christian monarchs to arrest Templars and seize their assets, the directive carried the full canonical weight of a papal command in kingdoms whose rulers were in good standing with Rome. In Scotland, in the autumn of 1307, that weight was rather different. The logical extension of this circumstance, one that has been made by writers and researchers across a considerable period of time, is that Scotland's ambiguous relationship with the papal directive made it a viable destination for Templars or Templar assets that needed to move beyond the reach of effective enforcement. The logic is sound as logic. It describes a real historical condition that genuinely existed. What it does not do is produce any documentary or material evidence that this is what actually happened, and the distinction between a plausible inference and a supported conclusion is one the record consistently enforces. The grave markers at Dock lean in the wet grass. The stone of the former preceptory walls ends at the level of the foundation and goes no higher. The archaeology below the surface is the archaeology of a Templar preceptory, nothing more specific, nothing more dramatic than that. On a gray morning in Midlothian, the place holds its own kind of quiet certainty, which is the certainty of a location where something once existed and then ceased to exist, where the ground gives back the shapes of what was built on it, and nothing further. The second direction the historical record opens toward is more fully documented, and the documentation it rests on is archival rather than conjectural. Portugal is not a theory, it is a jurisdiction with a paper trail. The situation of the Portuguese Templars in 1307 and the years immediately following differs from the situation in France in ways that the primary sources record with unusual clarity. King Denis I of Portugal did not share Philip IV's financial grievances against the order. The Portuguese Templars were not his principal creditors. And the crown's relationship with the order in Portugal was substantially different in character from the relationship between Philip and the Paris Temple. When the pressure to arrest and try the Templars arrived from Rome following Pastoralis Praemunentia, Denis moved toward the question by a different path. In 1310, Denis convened an inquiry at Medina del Campo. The inquiry was charged with examining the charges brought against the Templars in France and determining whether those charges held in the Portuguese context. The conclusion the inquiry reached was documented and formal. The Portuguese Templars were not found guilty of the charges that had been extracted under inquisitorial proceedings in France, charges that modern historians have consistently characterized as produced by coercion rather than reflecting any credible institutional practice. The Knights of the Portuguese Order were permitted, through the period of the inquiry, to live without the imprisonment and inquisitorial pressure that their counterparts in France had experienced. The contrast between the two jurisdictions, as documented in their respective records, could not be more legible. The Council of Vienne in 1312 dissolved the order in its universal form. The bull Vox in Excelso suppressed the Templars through what the document itself characterized as apostolic provision rather than judicial condemnation, a canonical distinction that had practical significance. The bull Ad Providima directed the Templar properties across Europe pass to the Knights Hospitaller, which is what happened in most jurisdictions. In Portugal, however, the transfer was resisted, and the property question remained unsettled for several years, as Dinis pursued a different resolution. The resolution he pursued produced a document. It is in the archive. It has a date. On March 14th, 1319, a papal bull established the Order of Christ. The bull is a specific surviving canonical document that transferred the Templar properties, the Templar personnel, and the institutional practices of the dissolved Portuguese order into a new form, chartered under a new name, with its seat at the castle and convent of Tomar. The transition was not a disguise or an evasion. It was a formal canonical act, negotiated between the Portuguese crown and the papal curia, producing the institutional outcome that Dinis had worked toward since the suppression became inevitable. The men who had been Templars became the men who were the Order of Christ. The properties that had been Templar properties became the properties of the Order of Christ. The ledger practices, the administrative structures, the revenue flows from the Order's Portuguese holdings. These continued without the interruption that characterized the Order's fate in France. Tomar stands today as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The designation reflects what survives there, an architectural complex of extraordinary integrity, built across several centuries, but organized around a Templar rotunda that dates to the 12th century and that still stands at the center of the later monastic additions. Its original Romanesque stonework unchanged, its circular plan intact, its relationship to the buildings added around it by the Order of Christ, and by subsequent patrons readable in the layers of construction that accumulate around it, like rings around a fixed point. The Convent of Christ at Tomar is the most complete surviving Templar architectural complex in the world. It survives because it was never suppressed. It was transferred. The archive room at Tomar holds volumes of the Order of Christ's administrative records from the 14th and 15th centuries. The spines of those bound volumes are worn from handling, the pages inside them containing the detailed financial and administrative documentation of an institution that managed substantial revenue from land holdings, from commercial activities, from the income streams that the Portuguese Templar organization had developed over the preceding 2 centuries, and that the Order of Christ simply absorbed and continued. The ledger practices in those volumes are recognizable as the practices of the order that preceded them. The property lists are the same properties. The institutional continuity is visible on the page, documented in medieval Portuguese, that sits in those volumes, many of them still unread, in the specific sense that no research program has yet undertaken a comprehensive translation and analysis of the complete archive. There is something in that fact, the fact of the unread volumes, that is not dramatic and not particularly mysterious, but that is genuinely and quietly interesting as a statement about where knowledge ends and where the record simply continues past the point that scholarship has yet reached. The archive at Tamar holds the administrative life of an institution whose origins run back through a formal canonical act in 1319 to an order whose existence began in 1119. 200 years of institutional history that continues in those bound volumes, whether or not any particular researcher has sat in that room and read them. The numbers are on the page, the columns are ruled, the entries are there. The figure who made the Order of Christ into something beyond a Portuguese ecclesiastical institution was Prince Henry, who served as its governor from 1420 until his death in 1460. What Henry did with the order's revenues during those 4 decades is documented in the records of the systematic WAD, exploration of the African coast that he organized and financed over that same period, a program of geographic inquiry that sent Portuguese ships progressively further along the Atlantic coast of Africa with each successive decade, each voyage extending the navigational knowledge available to the next. The order's revenues supported this enterprise. The institutional network of the Order of Christ, its ships, its personnel, its administrative infrastructure inherited from the Templars, was the material context within which Henry's program of exploration operated. The connection between the Templars and the Portuguese voyages of exploration is not a romantic claim. It is a matter of institutional continuity that the documents record without requiring any additional interpretation. The Order of Christ was the Templar organization in Portugal. Reconstituted under a new canonical form, Henry governed the Order of Christ for 4 decades and directed its resources towards systematic Atlantic exploration. The ships that carried Portuguese navigators down the African coast flew the insignia of the Order of Christ. The red cross that appears on the sails in contemporary visual records of the Portuguese voyages is the cross of an institution whose property lists and administrative practices descended in a direct documented line from the order that was suppressed in 1312. Vasco da Gama was a knight of the Order of Christ. When he completed the first sea voyage from Europe to India in 1499, completing a passage that had been the object of Portuguese navigational effort for decades, he wore the red cross of the order on his vestments. The record of this is not obscure. It is present in the documented visual and textual sources for the voyage. The cross on da Gama's clothing is the cross of an order whose charter was issued in 1319, whose properties and personnel came from an order suppressed in 1312, whose institutional history traces without interruption back to the Templars of the 12th century. None of this resolves the question of the movable wealth. It addresses what happened to the fixed assets in Portugal, which the documentary record tracks with reasonable clarity through the canonical act of 1319 and the subsequent institutional history of the Order of Christ. The question of the portable fortune, the gold bullion, the debt registers, the liturgical objects, the relics, the financial instruments whose absence from the October 1307 inventories of the Paris Temple remains the central unresolved feature of the historical record, sits at a different level. One, the Portuguese documents do not address, and one, the Scottish archaeology does not illuminate. The honest register for that question is the one the documents themselves enforce. It is open, not open in the sense that any particular answer is more likely than another, or that the evidence points clearly in one direction without being able to reach a conclusion. Open in the more specific sense that the record of what was absent from the Paris temple in October of 1307 has never been matched to any subsequent record of arrival, deposit, or disbursement in any archive that has been identified and examined. The movable wealth of the Templars left the historical record in the autumn of 1307 and has not re-entered it in any form that can be verified against a document. 7 centuries is a long time for an absence to persist. It is also not an unusual duration for archival gaps in medieval history, and the calm truth of that observation is that the absence of a record is not the same as evidence of concealment or loss. It is simply the condition of a particular kind of historical question, one that the surviving documents cannot answer, and that has not yet been answered by any object recovered from the ground. The theories that have accumulated around the Templar treasury over the centuries are numerous and varied in their plausibility. Some of them are grounded in real historical circumstances, the canonical ambiguity of Scotland in 1307, the documented institutional survival in Portugal, the real gaps in the French royal inventories. Others are attached to sites and claims that the physical evidence in the documentary record have examined without producing any supporting material. The grain of the historical record, read at the level of what it actually documents, consistently produces the same picture: an institution of documented and substantial wealth, an administrative suppression of extraordinary coordination and speed, an inventory that recorded far less than the institution's known capacity, and a silence in the archive afterward that has never been broken by any discovery of corresponding material. The convent of Christ at Tomar sits above the town in the hills of Ribetejo, its stone catching the light differently through the day as the sun moves around it. The 12th century rotunda at its center, enclosed by the later additions in the way that the original question is enclosed by the centuries of commentary that have accumulated around it. Visitors move through the cloister in the morning. The archive room is not on the standard tour. The volumes on its shelves are there for researchers who come with specific questions, and the time to sit with medieval Portuguese administrative documents in the particular quiet of an archive room that has been accumulating its contents for 7 centuries. The records in those volumes do not announce themselves as Templar records. The Order of Christ is named as the Order of Christ, its charter cited, its canonical status described, its properties listed under the names they carried in 1319, and afterward, a reader working backward from those documents, matching the property list to Templar records from the preceding century, tracing the administrative practices through the canonical transition, following the revenue figures and the ledger formats and the personnel records through the formal discontinuity of 1312 and 1319, would find the thread intact. The institutional continuity is there. It is in the documents. It simply requires the particular kind of sustained attention that archival research in medieval Portuguese demands, and that has not yet been applied to the full body of material in a comprehensive way. The question of what the Order of Christ inherited in 1319, not in terms of the fixed property, whose canonical transfer is recorded in Ad Privatum and the Bull of 1319, but in terms of whatever else the Portuguese Templars may have held at the time of the suppression, is one those volumes could potentially address, if the right document exists in them, and if the research to find and read it were undertaken. Whether such a document exists is not known. Whether the archive contains any record of portable wealth received or dispersed in the years immediately following the suppression is not known, because the full body of material has not been examined with that question in mind. That is the honest statement of where things stand. It is less dramatic than a discovered vault or a mapped destination, and it is more accurate than any version of the story that provides a confident resolution. The archive at Tomar is real. The volumes on its shelves are real. The question they might answer, the specific, narrow archival question of whether the Portuguese Templars held and transferred portable wealth that does not appear in the French inventories of 1307, is real. The answer is in the archive, if it is anywhere in the world, and the archive has not yet yielded it, and it may never yield it, because the document may not exist, because the records for the relevant period may have gaps of their own, because an institution that survived a canonical suppression by reconstituting itself under a new name may have had reasons, dawning 1319, and afterward, to leave certain things unwritten. The grave markers at Ballantradoc and the archive room at Tomar represent two different kinds of openness. The archaeology at Ballantradoc has been done, and it has produced what it produced, and the ground at the former preceptory has given back the shape of a medieval institution without giving back anything that changes the fundamental picture of what the October 1307 inventories recorded and did not record. The archive at Tomar is a different kind of openness, not the openness of ground that has been examined and returned its answer, but the openness of unread pages, of volumes whose spines are worn, but whose specific contents have not yet been fully translated and analyzed against the questions that the Templar treasury disappearance generates. Both places are quiet. Both places hold their evidence in their own form, the one in weathered stone, and the results of archaeological seasons cataloged in institutional collections, the other in bound volumes with worn spines and pages of medieval administrative script that catch no particular light and generate no particular urgency, sitting in a room in the hills above Tomar, exactly as they have sat for several centuries, the numbers in their columns as real and as unread as they were when the clerk who wrote them dipped his pen for the last time and moved on to the next entry, and the document dried and was bound and was shelved, and the institution it documented continued to function long after the clerk was gone and the specific act of writing was finished. What the history of the Knights Templar leaves in the world, apart from the philosophical societies and the architectural styles and the romantic mythology accumulated around it across the subsequent centuries, is a set of concrete institutional facts that can be stated without embellishment. An order of documented and substantial wealth was suppressed with extraordinary administrative efficiency in October of 1307. The fixed assets of that order were distributed by canonical act to successor institutions, and that distribution is documented with reasonable completeness. The movable wealth of the order was not present in the inventories taken by the officers of the French crown in the days following the suppression. No subsequent document in any archive that has been examined has recorded its arrival anywhere or accounted for its disposal. The ships at the La Rochelle harbor were not in the harbor when the royal officers came to inventory the compound. The debt registers that would have represented claims on sovereign revenues across Europe are not in any archive. The relics and liturgical objects of precious metal that the order maintained across its network of preceptories do not appear in any post-suppression inventory as seized, inherited, or discovered. The question this leaves is genuine. It is not a manufactured mystery or a romantic elaboration. It is the record's own gap, produced by the comparison between what the order demonstrably held and what the October 1307 inventories recorded as found. The question is genuine, and it is old, and it has not been answered, and it may not be answered, and there is a particular quality of stillness that comes from sitting with that last possibility, not the stillness of frustration or of abandonment, but but the stillness of an archive in the quiet hours when no one is working. The volumes on the shelves exactly where they were placed, the entries in the columns exactly as they were written, the sealed documents exactly as they were sealed, the questions they could answer waiting with the particular patience of things that do not know they are being waited for. The Order of Christ continued past the age of Henry the Navigator, past the age of Vasco da Gama, past the age of Portuguese imperial expansion, and into subsequent centuries. Its administrative identity eventually absorbed into the Portuguese crown, and then into the changed institutional landscape of a later era. The Convent of Christ at Tomar was declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1983, which placed it within a formal framework of preservation and scholarly attention that continues to maintain it. Researchers visit the archive. The archive is accessible to researchers with the appropriate credentials and the appropriate questions. The volumes are there. The archive room at Tomar at a quiet hour has the specific atmosphere of a room where documents have been kept for a very long time. The smell of old paper and the particular quality of silence that accumulates in enclosed spaces that have been used for the same purpose across many generations. The shelves holding their volumes in the same positions they have held them for decades. The light in the room, whatever the light happens to be at that particular hour of the day. The clerk's entries in the columns of a 14th century administrative record do not announce themselves as historically significant. They are the routine documentation of an institution going about its institutional business. Income from this property, expenses against that account, the name of the officer responsible, the date, the witness. The routine documentation of an institution going about its institutional business is what survives when the dramatic events are over, when the suppression has been executed, and the canonical transition has been completed, and the ships have gone wherever they went, and the inventories have been closed and filed, and the officers of the crown have moved on to other assignments.